I've been thinking a lot about the Easter story, obviously, over the past couple of weeks, because as we think about the Easter story and we think about what God did, and as we continue this journey that we are on from Easter to the day of Pentecost, I've been thinking about some of the different things that have happened. And over the past couple of weeks, I've been thinking in particular about how absolutely crazy the story of Easter is, right? I mean, imagine if we took the story of Easter and we put it into today's terms, okay? So it's not just a story that happened 2,000 years ago, but let's talk about it today, okay? So imagine that I tell you about my friend Bob. I got this friend Bob. We've been really good friends, and unfortunately, I tell you that my friend Bob has passed away. Now, it was pretty messed up because my friend Bob died at center ice during a Barrie Colts game with a packed auditorium full of people. So like he died in front of a lot of people. A whole bunch of people saw him die. I'm not going to get into what Bob was doing at center ice during a Barrie Colts game because, it's kind of weird and messed up. So I'm not going to tell you about that, right? But imagine, though, that all those people, I think it's like 5,000 people or something it holds, they all saw Bob die at center ice. They saw how all the paramedics work on him, and they saw him carted off. And then the announcer got on and said, "I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, for this interruption, but I'm afraid the gentleman has passed away. Could we have a moment of silence, please?" And so that whole thing happens, right? Bob's dead. Then I tell you about how we had a very lovely service for Bob. We went to the Barrie Union Cemetery, which is on Ann Street, and we had an internment, and I watched as Bob's coffin was lowered into the ground, and we all threw a bunch of dirt on top of it, and Bob was buried. Now, you would feel sorry for me, and you would say, "Oh, I'm so sorry for your loss. I'm sorry that your friend Bob died. That's terrible." Now, up until now, everything aside from the weird story about center ice at the Barrie Colts game, everything up until now is pretty normal. There's not anything kind of weird. It's just pretty normal. But now imagine if a couple of days later you see me and you say to me, "Oh, how are you doing about, your friend Bob? Are you doing okay?" And I start telling you, well, to be honest, you're never going to believe this, but I saw Bob alive again just yesterday. Now, you have a choice to make at this point, right? You could be nice, or you could be not nice, but you're going to be struggling with the fact that I'm telling you that I saw my friend Bob, who was dead and we buried, alive again. Let that sink in for a second. Let that sink in. How crazy is that? Think about the last person you know who had someone die, and then they came and told you that person's alive again. It's almost impossible to not think that they're absolutely insane. How do you respond to that, right? So maybe if you're a nice person, you actually start thinking that maybe I miss Bob so much that I am hallucinating Bob's presence. That's how I've got almost like a psychosis is being brought on by my grief. Maybe you think that. Maybe you think there's an underlying condition that I didn't know about, and it's been exacerbated by Bob passing away. And so you think maybe you think I'm hallucinating or something like that. Or maybe you think that I think I'm seeing a ghost or something like that. You know what I mean? But I don't drop it. What happens if I don't drop it? It doesn't go away. I keep telling people that I have seen Bob back from the dead. Not a ghost, not a hallucination, but I'm telling people that I actually believe that my friend Bob, who died, was buried, is now alive again, and you could touch him, and he's actually alive again, a real, honestly, decidedly not dead person. That's crazy, right? Crazy. Now, here's the problem. You see, it's easy for us to believe that the scriptures were written at a time and place that is so incredibly different from where we're at now. Do you know what I mean? Like, The people who lived 2,000 years ago, they weren't anything like us, right? We start thinking about these stories as myths and as fairy tales, and we start thinking about the characters in these stories as if they're fictional characters who don't actually really have, critical thinking skills and emotions and, feelings about things, right? Like things were totally different back then. Except that these were real people. These were people just like you, just like me. People who had ideas about the world, people who had families to try to provide for, people who had jobs to go to, people who had ideas about faith and about God, people who had ideas about science and things like that. It was different than ours, but they understood when someone was dead and when somebody was not dead. And they would have had the same kind of reaction that you would have if I told you about my friend Bob who died and then rose again. They would have the same kind of doubts. They would have the same questions. They would have the same sinking feeling that their friend was losing their mind, right? So does it matter? The question is, does it actually matter when we think about the death and resurrection of Jesus? Does it actually matter? Do we actually care, right? Now, some people try to deal with the craziness of Jesus dying and rising again. Some people try to deal with it by trying to imagine a way that the story takes place that's not as crazy sounding. Some people have tried to pretend that Jesus didn't actually die. He just fainted on the cross and the Romans were mistaken and he wasn't really dead when they shoved the spear into his heart. Some people have kind of said that. Some people try to argue that the disciples were hallucinating. There was like mass hysteria, mass hallucinations. Some people have even tried to argue that Jesus was just a ghost when he came back from the dead. And then some people they try to argue that the story of the resurrection, the story of Jesus dying, being buried in the tomb, and then coming back to life again is actually just really supposed to be a metaphor. It's supposed to bring us hope. It's supposed to talk about, the metaphor of new life and of new beginning and of, this kind of stuff. But it didn't actually happen, because if you believe that it actually happened, that's crazy, right? You know what I mean? And it's not a new thing, by the way. This isn't a new thing. This way of trying to make the story less crazy isn't a new thing. It's not just something that we dreamed up because we're all modern and enlightened and scientific now. And back in the olden times, they didn't care about that kind of stuff. Back in the olden times, people were always rising from the dead. It was like a common occurrence, and nobody would think it was weird at all, right? No, this was going on even back then, because it was just as crazy sounding back then as it is today. The story of Bob rising from the dead is just as crazy as the story of Jesus rising from the dead. In fact, Paul even talks about this exact issue in his first letter that he writes to the church that was in a city called Corinth. And it seems, now remember, whenever we read any of the letters in the New Testament, the epistles, epistle just fancy word for letter, it's like we're listening to one side of a phone conversation, so we have to sort of guess what was going on based off of what Paul says to the church, right? So it seems like what's been going on is it seems like there are some people in the church who are starting to raise some questions about this crazy thing that everybody's talking about, that Jesus died, was buried, rose again. And so Paul says this. Let's start in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We're going to start at verse 1. He says, "Brothers and sisters, I want to call your attention to the good news that I preached to you, which you also received and in which you stand." I get a kick out of this because it sounds a little bit like a backhanded compliment. Almost, right? Like he's like, I want to call your attention to that thing you received. In some translations, take what you first believed, and now you don't stand. There's a sense like it's like, hey guys, you believed it, you understood it, you got the point, and now you no longer believe this stuff. I want to call you back to what I first preached to you. And then he goes on and he lays it out for everybody. He goes on and he lays out, in a sense, he kind of summarizes the how of the gospel message. And he says that Jesus died for our sins, was buried, and rose again on the third day. He says, I preached that to you, you believed that, you accepted it, and I want to draw your attention back to it because you seem to have left that. For Paul, that Jesus was crucified, that he was buried, and that he rose again on the third day, this seems to be the how of this gospel message that he's preaching, that it's what makes it all work. It isn't the gospel message. It's just the how of it. The gospel message is much bigger than this, but it's the how of this gospel message. A little later, he makes it even more clear when he says this. He says, if Christ hasn't been raised, then your faith is worthless. You are still in your sins, and what's more, those who have died in Christ are gone forever. Your faith is worthless. Some translations say your faith is in vain. You see, for Paul, it isn't a metaphor. For Paul, it's not a metaphor at all. For Paul, Jesus died on the cross, he was buried, he was in the tomb for 3 days, and then his body came back to life and walked out of the tomb 3 days later. For Paul, that actually happened, and it absolutely matters because for Paul, he understands that reality changed something in all of the cosmos. That when Jesus walked out of the tomb, something changed forever. That somehow the brokenness that exists in our world, the ways in which the world is not how God intends it to be, somehow that action, that reality changed something at the very metaphysical level of our universe, and it was no longer the same ever again. It wasn't a metaphor, an analogy, a story, a myth, a fairy tale. It was an actual occurrence, and it is crazy, crazy stuff to actually think about. At Vox, we have tried to do away with as much churchy Christianese language as we can to make what we have to say make sense to everybody, so that everybody who is watching today gets an equal participation in the service, in what we're doing. Because so often in churches, there's so much churchy language that you can feel like a real outsider if you're not careful. And so we try to do away with a lot of things. And then there's other things like the idea of being a Christian. You know, when someone says, are you a Christian? That word just means so many different things to so many different people that I don't even know how to answer the question because I don't know what you mean by it. And so we use the phrase that I'm a follower of Jesus. I like Jesus. I believe he has the words of life, and I want to live my life the way he taught me to live. One of the other things that we talk about is this idea of becoming a follower of Jesus is believing that Jesus is who he said he was and that Jesus did what he said he did. And so when Jesus talks about himself as God, as this revelation of who God is, as God with skin on, we believe that he was telling the truth. And that when he talks about how he had come to put things right again, that not only was he teaching us how to live this rich, full, and abundant life, this kingdom kind of life, but he was going to do something through his death that was going to fix what was broken in the world. And that when he walked out of the tomb, there was a new chapter, a new beginning, a new kingdom, a new reality. And we believe that Jesus accomplished what he said he was going to accomplish. Jesus is who he said he was. And that he did what he said he would do. That somehow this problem of sin would be conquered when he walked out of the tomb. There's a passage that I threw in afterwards, Rob, so don't try to track this down here. But there's a passage in 1 Corinthians here, 15, starting at verse 21, where Paul says, since death came through a human being, the resurrection of the dead came through one too, in the same way that everyone dies in Adam, so everyone will be given life in Christ. Paul is talking about how this reality that Jesus dying and rising again changed something in the world. So, let's go back to my friend Bob for a second. Talk amongst yourselves for a sec while we think about Bob. Now, I have told you that my friend Bob died. And then I have told you that not only did my friend Bob die, but my friend Bob came back to life again. Now, if you're a good friend, you're starting to be concerned. You're starting to be concerned about me because I shouldn't be believing that Bob died and then came back from the dead. And I know that you're concerned about me, so I start defending myself. I start coming up with arguments. I'm like, no, you don't understand. I wasn't the only one to see Bob after he came back to life again. No, I'm serious. There are a whole bunch of people who saw Bob. I'm not the only Bob witness. There's a whole bunch of people who saw Bob come back to life again. In fact, there's like huge groups of people. I tell you about my one friend, Tommy. Tommy didn't believe. He was just like you. I told Tommy that Bob had come back to life again, and Tommy was like, bull honky, that he came back to life again. People don't come back to life again. I don't believe that Bob came back to life again. Tommy says, I'm not going to believe unless I get to see the burn marks left by the paddles when they tried to resuscitate him with the defibrillator. So you're not going to believe this. But Bob showed up at Tommy's house, and Tommy got to see where the burn marks were from the defibrillator. He even got to touch them. And so now Tommy's going around, he's telling everybody about Bob coming back from the dead again. Man, it's crazy. And then there's this one time, Bob shows up, and there's like 500 people there. And all 500 people saw Bob alive again, and they talked to Bob, and Bob was mingling in the crowd, and he's like glad-handing everybody, and everybody's like, oh my goodness, Bob, you look so good for a dead person. And Bob's like, I know, thank you, I've been working out, right? Like there's this whole conversation, and all these people are witnesses to Bob alive again. Now, if I told you this stuff about my friend Bob, you are going to want to go check it out. Because I just told you that there are other people who have seen Bob alive. You're definitely going to want to go talk to Tommy because Tommy even doubted. So you're going to want to check with Tommy and make sure, Tommy, like, for real, you actually saw the burn marks? Yeah, I saw the burn marks, man. It was real. Did you touch the burn marks? I touched him. It was kind of creepy. But I touched him, and he's really there. You're going to want to go talk. You're going to go track down 1, 2, 10, 100 of the 500 people who saw Jesus alive again because you want corroborating evidence, right? We've all seen Law and Order. Dunk, dunk. We've all seen Law and Order. We all know that that's what you're supposed to do. And if people are still alive that saw Bob, you're going to want to go talk to the people who saw Bob. This is exactly the argument that Paul makes in his letter to the church in Corinth. It says this. He says, he appeared to Cephas, which is what Paul calls Peter. It's Peter's real name. He appeared to Cephas, so he appeared to Peter, then to the 12, so the disciples, and then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at once. Most of them are still alive to this day, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, Jesus' half-brother, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me as if I was born at the wrong time. This letter is written about 20, 25 years after Jesus died. So a lot of these people that Paul is talking about, they're still alive. You could still go talk to them if you wanted to talk to them. You could still go find out if it's actually true. You could ask them questions. You can say, I don't really believe you that this Jesus rose from the dead again. And you could ask them to find out if their stories actually line up or not. And you probably would. Because it's a crazy story. So you would. You would go check them out. You would want to find out, do they tell the same stories? Does it seem the same that Jesus is the same person? Does it seem like Jesus' risen body is actually a body, not a ghost, not a something else? You totally could go and verify all these stories. You could go and find out if they were crazy or not, right? Because let's be honest, the first person who tells you the story, you think they're nuts. So you want to find out, are they crazy? Do they seem like a crazy person? Because if they seem like a crazy person, you're like, okay, you're just nuts. You say insane stories all the time. You're always making stuff up. You're always coming up with these great big stories. But 500? Let's say 300 of them are still alive. You start to realize, no, some of these people are important people. They're business leaders. They're leaders in their communities. They're religious leaders. They're government officials. And they all are telling the same story. Can you see how the story is starting to sound a little less crazy? I mean, it's still crazy. It's still hard to believe, but it's a little less hard to believe. Now, there seems to be a problem. There's an embarrassing problem with my Bob story. And so you're starting to get concerned because, I'm not dropping it. I'm still believing that Bob is back from the dead again. I'm still believing that Bob is alive and well and kicking, and he's out there doing his thing, and he's not dead anymore. And I'm telling people this story. And I tell you about all these people who saw Bob alive, but then I have to, one day I'm like, I got to tell you, man, I got to tell you something, okay? I wasn't the first person to see Bob alive again. The first people to see Bob alive again were actually these two crack addicts. Now, they came up to me and they told me, hey, we know you're friends with that Bob guy. We just saw Bob, and he's not dead anymore. He's alive. And I was like, there's no way, because I was at his funeral. And they're like, no, we saw Bob alive again. And so I ran off to go find Bob where they told me Bob was, and sure enough, there was Bob. Now, I haven't been telling people that that's the first people that saw Bob alive again because, they're not exactly the best witnesses. I was a little embarrassed. I mean, I really would have liked it. I would have liked it if there'd been some better first witnesses. You know what I mean? Like maybe a priest or a lawyer or a politician or some, that kind of sounds like the beginning of a joke, doesn't it? A priest, a lawyer, and a politician walk into an unmarked grave. No, just kidding. But I was kind of hoping that it was somebody more respectable, would have been like the first people to see Bob alive, but I can't lie. And the truth is, it was these two guys who are really struggling with addiction. I'm really glad that a few other people have seen Bob since then, but it's tricky. Now, the problem is the same for Paul. The problem is the same for Paul. He is concerned clearly about the first people who saw Jesus alive again because he doesn't include them in his list. He doesn't let everybody know that Mary and Joanna and Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Jesus' mother Mary were actually the first people to see Jesus alive. Now, before you get mad at me, because clearly in this I am comparing crack addicts and women, and I'm not trying to say anything bad about people who struggle with drug addiction, and I'm certainly not trying to say anything bad about women, but the truth of the matter is that in our current day, there's so much stigma around drug addiction that if that was the case, they probably wouldn't be taken seriously. And at this time that the scriptures are being written, women were so disrespected by those outside of the followers of Jesus, for the most part, that they weren't even allowed to be witnesses in court. They weren't allowed to be an official witness because nobody took their word seriously. I'm not saying that I think that. I'm saying that was the contemporary context. I would like to be very clear about all of that. Please do not send me hate mail. I'm not interested. You can send cookies, but actually maybe I'm allergic to nuts, so hate mail would be like walnut cookies or something. Anyways, I'm not saying that, but it's important. It's important that we understand that this is actually kind of embarrassing in the story. It's an awkward part of the story, and it's something that actually you can tell Paul is trying to kind of make it go away a little bit, because he knows that first century people aren't going to like that the first witnesses weren't considered to be trustworthy. So is it actually a problem? Well, here's the thing. it actually ends up being a strength, not a problem. And let me tell you why. So, when scholars are looking at historical documents, ancient historical documents, and they're trying to understand and decide how reliable an ancient historical document is, how much can we believe what's being written down here? Because the truth is, they could have written anything, right, if they wanted to. And so they're trying to figure out how reliable is it. They use a couple of things that they call the indications of authenticity. And these are sort of understood in historical communities, and there's a few different ones. One of them is called historical congruence. Now, historical congruence goes like this. X, so the document in question, X fits in with known historical facts concerning the context in which X is said to have happened. So does this document, does the story being told in this document actually fit in with other things we know from that time? So, for example, the story of Jesus talks about Caiaphas the high priest, and in other places we have record of Caiaphas being the high priest. And so, okay, yeah, it's starting to fit in. Okay, good. Another one is called independent early attestation. So X appears in multiple sources which are near to the time at which X is alleged to have occurred and which depend neither upon each other or a common source. So if something is said to have happened, can we read about it in a bunch of different places? And the Gospels pass this test as well. We can read about some of the things they talk about in other areas. But the one that I want to focus on today is called embarrassment. Embarrassment. X is awkward or counterproductive for the persons who serve as the source of the information for X. What that means is simple. In other words, if somebody is making something up, if they are inventing a story, if they're coming up with a lie, particularly when they are writing down history, they don't tend to do it in a way that makes themselves look bad. Right? We know that this is the case in ancient history. We always sort of know that ancient documents are always trying to make the people who are writing them seem like the good guys, right? I always say history is determined by the people who win the war, right? They'll be the good guys, and the people who lost are the bad guys, that kind of thing. And it's one of the reasons why we have a hard time trusting numbers when it comes to ancient documents, because people like to inflate their numbers just like we do today, right? And so that is that kind of thing going on because people like to make it seem as if they are better than they are, or at least they're going to put their best foot forward. So here's the thing. If you're making up a story, right? If you're making up a story like this, about Jesus come back to life, about my friend Bob who died, was buried, and rose again, then you're not going to make up details that actually make your story less trustworthy. I wouldn't tell you about Bob being found by a couple of people struggling with addiction. I would tell you a story about how Bob was found by a politician or a lawyer or somebody like that. Somebody important, somebody that you're going to believe, because I would want to make up the best story that I possibly can. The fact that the scriptures include, all of the Gospels tell the story about Mary being the first person to find the empty tomb. They tell you that because it happened, even though it makes their case weaker. So, you're never going to believe this, but the whole Bob thing is really taking off. Like, I told a couple people, like, they told me Bob's back alive, and I went running, and I found Bob, and Bob was like, yeah, I'm alive again. I was like, oh my goodness, Bob, I'm so glad to see you. And I went and told Tommy, and I went and told a bunch of our friends we used to hang out, and then Bob showed up at that party with the 500 people, right? And they're all out there, and they were like, oh my goodness, Bob's alive. So then everybody, what started happening is it wasn't just me telling people that Bob's alive. Now everybody started telling people that Bob's alive again, and now it's like getting huge, and like everybody in town knows that Bob is alive, and people are like, no, he can't be alive. I was at the Barry Molson Center. I saw him die. They're like, no, he's alive. And so they tell more people, and it's really growing. And the authorities are starting to get kind of upset about the whole Bob story because, dead people don't come back to life, and they're getting kind of concerned that all these people are starting to believe that Bob came back to life, and they're getting upset. There's all these like Bob evangelists out there going around telling everybody about Bob, the risen Bob, and they're just like, oh my goodness, I don't know what we got to do. We got to shut this down. So then they decide that they're going to exhume Bob's body. Things are getting crazy. And so everybody gathers at the cemetery, and like, man, cops are there because there's traffic problems, and the backhoe's there, and it starts digging down, and they get down to the coffin, and they lift Bob's coffin out of the ground, and you could see one of the city leaders. He's looking all smug, and he's like, finally, all you people are going to realize that Bob is dead, and dead people don't come back to life. And he opens up the coffin. You already know. No, Bob's body is not in the coffin. There's no body. They thought for sure they're going to show us Bob's body. They're going to do a DNA test, and that's going to shut this whole thing down. But there's no body because Bob is alive. Ooh, baby. Religious leaders had the same problem in Jesus' day. Same problem. You see, we think it's a myth, a fairy tale, a story that happened 2,000 years ago. So all of these normal things you would do, we're like, no, they wouldn't have done that. 100% they would have done that. 100% they would have loved to have produced Jesus' body. That would have shut the whole thing down. No more followers of Jesus. They're like, here's the dead body, and everybody's like, all right, I guess you got us, right? But they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it. And they knew that they had a problem on their hands. Because even after they put Jesus in the tomb, they knew that there was a danger to this. And so the Bible tells us that they actually placed a guard in front of the tomb. Now, when it says a guard, it doesn't mean a soldier. So Bob being guarded by Jim, that's not what they meant. A guard was a group of soldiers that would have been placed in front of the tomb to make sure that the disciples couldn't come and try to steal Jesus' body or do something kind of weird or anything like that. And we don't know how many of them there were, how many soldiers they were, but we know that they would have been more than a match for a bunch of fishermen and tradesmen who were Jesus' disciples. We know that there would have been no chance of overpowering them. And Matthew actually tells us about all of this going down. In Matthew 28, starting at verse 11, it says, now as the women were on their way, so they've gone and they've found the empty tomb, and the guards had been knocked out. They're asleep. They're all lying on the ground, and they wake up and the tomb is empty, and the women have just found this out, and the guards are like, oh no, we're in so much trouble. And so the women run off to tell the disciples, and the guards head back into town. So it says the guards came into the city, and they told the chief priests everything that had happened. They met with the elders and decided to give a large sum of money to the soldiers. They told them, say that Jesus' disciples came at night and stole his body while you were sleeping, and if the governor hears about this, we will take care of it with him, so you will have nothing to worry about. So the soldiers took the money, did as they were told, and this report has been spread throughout all of Judea to this very day. Now, there's a line in this that is really important. It says, if the governor hears about this, we will take care of it with him, so you will have nothing to worry about. All right, today, if you fall asleep at work, your boss is going to be kind of ticked off at you. Well, now today, if you fall asleep at work, your Zoom call thing is just going to be whatever your little image is, and nobody's even going to know you're asleep, right? For Roman soldiers, if you fell asleep on duty, you were executed. They did not mess around. They did not play games. If you did not do what you were told to do, you were executed. Roman soldiers are some of the best trained soldiers in the world. There's a famous story of one general commanded a whole legion of his troops to just march them into the ocean to their death, and they did. That's how well trained they were. They did not fall asleep. So that's why that passage, that verse is in there, because they're like, look, we know that if you are out there telling people you fell asleep on duty and Pilate hears about it, you're dead. Here's how we know this whole thing's a lie, because the story spread. There's no way that they would have allowed that story to spread unless it was a lie. It smells like a cover-up. Quite frankly, the religious elite and the soldiers should have worked harder to come up with a better cover-up story, because this one is just not believable. And all that's to say that the earliest records that we have that aren't in the Bible about the fact that this story about Jesus spread, and the fact that they didn't have a body and they had no way to prove that Jesus wasn't dead, exists. The ancient historian, I'm going to try English. The ancient historian Flavius Josephus wrote about 50 years, less than 50 years after Jesus' death. He wrote this. He's talking about the time of Jesus. He said, "At this time, there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, but those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have reported wonders, and the tribe of Christians, so named after him, has not disappeared to this day." My story about Bob, it kind of makes a crazy story seem less crazy, doesn't it? I mean, it's still crazy. But it kind of makes it almost a little easier to believe. Because when we think about it in terms of today, in terms of what you would do if I started telling you I had a friend who came back to life, if all those things kind of work, the story isn't so hard to believe. Like, if it was true, right? Like, if there really were lots of witnesses you could talk to about Bob being alive again, well, you would. And if they all said the same thing, you'd have to think about it, wouldn't you? And if my story had details that I wouldn't include if I was making up a story, well, that would make it seem a little more believable. And if there really wasn't any body, if we all saw Bob go in the ground and then there was no Bob to come back out of the ground, well, that would be hard, right? He's not quite as crazy as it sounds. It would be harder to deny anymore. And you know, those aren't even the best reasons for believing that Jesus is who he said he was and that Jesus did what he said he did. I still believe that the best reason to believe that Jesus is who he said he was and he did what he said he did is that when I live my life the way he taught me to live, it actually works. It makes sense. And then I have to start saying, how does Jesus know so much about how to live life? Well, maybe it's because when he said that he is the one who created life, that he's telling the truth. You know? And when I pray to him today, and then he answers me, maybe he actually is what he said he is, and maybe he did what he said he did. This morning, my goal is not to try to prove anything beyond just some shadow of a doubt. I'm not interested in doing, the case for Christ or the case for faith. That wasn't really my goal. My goal was more when we talk about faith with people in our world today. Sometimes people look at us like we're nuts. They look at us like we believe some quaint story. Like, oh, okay, that's nice. That's good. I believe in elves, whatever it is. And they're like, oh, okay, we're the same. And it's like, no. This thing that I have given my life to, this thing that I have made the foundation of every decision that I make, my life as a disciple of Jesus affects how I raise my kids, how I love my wife, how I pastor this church, how I drive truck for a garbage bin company. It affects everything because it's less crazy than all the bullshit the world tells me I'm supposed to believe. It's less crazy than capitalism. It's less crazy than politics will be our savior. It is less crazy than I need to look out for number one. It's less crazy than all the other options. I know it's hard to believe that somebody died and came back to life again, but that is less unbelievable than all the other nonsense our world is constantly trying to cram down our throats. What I want us to understand is that it's still going to take a leap of faith. But that leap of faith is a lot smaller than you maybe thought it was. It's why I can say with Paul, I passed on to you as most important what I also received. Christ died for our sins in line with the scriptures. He was buried and he rose on the third day in line with the scriptures. He is risen and he is my rabbi, and I still follow him. Let's pray.